We've been talking a lot this year about the idea that Jesus believes something about you, and oftentimes we only talk about what others are. And when we talk about ourselves, it's from a view of others, which is fine, but yet we've talked about this earlier, and in fact, Morgan said it earlier on the year. When we have this view of ourselves and compare it to how others think about us, when it doesn't match up, when it matches up in the wrong way, we see that as confirmation that we aren't what we are. That we see that as a confirmation that we must be something less than we really are, or something less than we want to be. That when they think we are something that we already think we are, and it's not good, it must be confirmation, which the way Morgan said it means it must be true. And so I want you to know, every single one of you, since not all of you got that, and you're not going to, because you'll get it next year for some of you, it's simply, I want you to know how much we think about it. One of the ways I like to talk about Jesus is the same way. I emphasize it when I preach the last 2 times, actually on Sunday morning, is to emphasize the fact that Jesus thought of you so much he did this. It's to not forget that for all of eternity, this is not what I want to talk about tonight, this is bonus, that for all of eternity, God's focus was towards his creation and towards his most personal, intimate creation, and that was us. That everything Jesus did in creation, it tells us, that Jesus, according to John, nothing was created without Jesus. That the Trinity has always been, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit has always been. And everything they ever did had you and I in mind. Or as Jesus puts it in John 14, he says, do not let your hearts be troubled, trust in God. If you trust in God, trust also in me. Why? Because where I'm going, you will come. And I'm going to prepare a place for you. And there's no doubt when we read those words in John, when he's talking about you, he's not just talking about the 12 disciples, because he spent so much energy praying for us in John 17. That on Jesus' heart when he went to the cross was every single one of us. That no matter what we would do, according to Romans, his view of you was you were worth it. His view of you is that everything about you was so amazing, it was worth telling you. That's what I think amazing. Think about this. Jesus went out of his way to inspire through his Spirit, because as John said this morning, it's the Spirit of Jesus. He's going to send his Spirit to us. As Romans says, that if Christ is in you, the Spirit is in you. That he was sending us his Spirit because when he thought of you, he had to be with you. That's the reality. Is that Jesus wanted to break down every single barrier because what he thought about you was so worth being with. Is in our society, oftentimes, we just want to think about what others think about us. And I think it's so important, as we will look more in the summer, is that most of the time, I want you to see, is that Jesus was intentional and proactive to think about you, and how he thinks about you is usually almost always better than you and I anticipate. And here's the reason why I think that's true. This is where we're going to go for a few minutes, okay? And then we're going to get in our small groups, and then we're going to go get ice cream, and I'm going to buy it if you want to come, okay? Evan's like, can you shut up already? Ice cream. I'm just kidding, because he definitely likes this for ice cream. So here's the reason why I think we live that way. The reason why we struggle. The reason why maybe some of you are nervous. In fact, one of the my favorite things I heard in one of the videos that we displayed this morning was when Evan said, I'm confident I won't slip from the faith because of what his parents, like he knew that his parents saw something in him, that us as a church, he emphasized that everybody had a hand, and that he knew that I have reasons to have confidence. But the reason he even cares to say that, I would assume, I didn't ask him to forgive me for assumptions here, is because in our society, the assumption is that we're going to struggle. Because most people do probabilistically. Go look at the statistics. Don't actually be discouraging. We struggle in that area. Is that there is some tension that we live in that says we want success, but failure seems to be the likelihood. Let me say it again. Every single one of us wants success, but failure seems to be the likelihood. One more time. Every single one of us wants success, but failure seems to be, as we look across social media, as we listen to people's testimonies. We even have a phrase for this. Does anybody know what the phrase is for a freshman that you're soon going to come back with? The freshman 15. See, what is it about you seniors recognizing? I'm like, I know, I've heard about that one. Anybody reminds me. Don't come back with the freshman that you're going to go with this view of success, but the likelihood that everybody reminds you of is failure. In fact, many of you probably heard this with the stories, for those the 2 of you going to Purdue, is how difficult college actually can be. Some of the smartest kids from last year, by the way, struggled severely in some of their math classes. I understand, since I did all this. I mean, and Evan's over here like, thanks for the reminder. That we are going with this expectation in life, and you don't have to be a senior to have this, going with this expectation in life to get success, while being reminded repeatedly that the likelihood is failure. In fact, go through the New Testament, go through the Gospels. And the Gospels are really all about discovering 12 men and all the other ladies and gentlemen that would surround Jesus, and all they ever had was failure. The disciples hardly ever saw our success. If we took a tally of the disciples' life, the reality for every single one of us is that as we pursue success, failure would be the expectation. If we would pursue and desire success, failure would be the expectation. And this is why this is such actually a scary problem for us. I want you to know. Because I think the conclusion we come with is that failure excludes us from success. That failure excludes us from success. That if failure is my likelihood, then my anticipation and expectation will be is that I'm going to be excluded from the group of failure. I mean, let me just ask you this question. Go back and remember, remind yourself and put yourself in the position of the first time you failed at something. Maybe at least you didn't succeed to the level. So it's a failure, maybe not because it was a pure failure, but because you just didn't achieve and meet your own expectations. Remember back to that day. I remember hearing from a freshman just last week who was telling me that they got a 6% on a grade on a test in Calc 2. They don't know, so it's not punch just to clarify. 6%. I remember the first time and only time I ever failed a test. It was my freshman year of college. Sorry, guys. It wrecked me. And it was in chemistry, and I hated science, to be honest. I never took any sciences in high school if I didn't have to. Thank you, Liv. You know that right there. I took every basic science class you could and still get honors in high school. Okay, so I could walk away with the honors diploma. Totally did that. Got a little medallion, the jigger dude. But I took the most basic science. All the math classes, no science. Got to college, took chemistry, and failed that first test and was like, what in God's green earth just happened? Well, my mom's a nurse, so I piled on all this. Like my whole vision of myself was wrecked that day. My very first test I took in college in any of my classes was that one, and I got 43%. Now, compared to those who got 6%, dude, I felt successful. But the likelihood is for all of us, if you listen to stories of what your future looks like, is that you have this high inflated, successful picture for yourself. But the way we're reminded is that you're going to live in unmet expectations. And I want to let you hear this today, is that failures do not exclude you from success. The stories that you and I have been told at times, an image of the future maybe that you've been encouraged to buy into isn't true. Failures do not exclude you from the camp of success. Let me explain it this way. There's a character in the Bible that absolutely amazes me. In fact, I love him because he's rambunctious. I love this character in the Bible. In fact, he's probably the most prominent character in the New Testament, despite he didn't author that much, but he was an author of the New Testament to give you a little bit of a hint. But he's probably the most prominent character, and even the Catholic Church put him as the most prominent character in the New Testament besides Jesus. Okay, and this character, I love him because of his rambunctious, energetic, never kind of shut his mouth. Relate to that a little bit. When he spoke, he got really passionate about things. I've been told by my staff that my coworkers that if anything needs to be said, if anything seems dumb, just make Jason believe it's stupid, and he'll tell somebody. I guess that's my reputation, and Stacy's laughing. It's true. Whenever there needs to be something, they come tell me, and for whatever reason, they get said. I think they use me, but it's true. I have this reputation. I understand this character named Peter, who repeatedly throughout the Bible was one of the first called, one of the first to declare allegiance to Jesus, the one who spoke up all the time and has unbelievable testimonies written throughout the Gospels. It didn't wait till Acts. It didn't wait till Stephen's in Acts and the other disciples. No. Peter is the one who is repeatedly recorded as saying amazing things to Jesus. And every time he says something good, he gets kicked in the rear. I mean, it's just true. Every single time. So when he actually makes, in Matthew chapter 9, when he makes the declaration that Jesus is actually the Christ, the Son of the living God, and Jesus looks at him and says, "You will be the rock on which I build my church." Right after that, Jesus, in the same chapter, says to him, "Get behind me, Satan." He rebukes him and says, "Get behind me." And at the end of the story, we find Peter as an individual who we know says to Jesus, If you guys remember in the upper room before Jesus dies, if everybody else leaves you, I won't. Does anybody remember what Peter says? I will go to prison and I will, Thanos, if anybody was in church this morning.
Die.
I will die for you. Thank you. That's me. Like, I don't know why you had to say it that way, but thanks. I will die. I try to picture Thanos and all the rings on his knuckles. Never mind. Anyway, but yes, like he says, I will die for you, Jesus. And what does Peter do next? Like he sets himself up with this image of success that I'm going to be, if there's anybody who will follow you faithfully, Peter says, it's me. I mean, he just paints this beautiful picture that I'm going to be the one for you, Jesus. Because Jesus has been hinting, Jesus is actually very forward and says, one of you will betray you, all of you will scatter tonight, what Jesus says. Jesus prophesied to them what would happen in yet a few hours, likely by the point in which Jesus says this. And yet, Peter paints this amazing picture. And what does he do that night? Denies him not once, but
3 times.
3 times. And he does it, each denial gets even more emphatic. I mean, he goes from just saying, I don't know the guy, to to swearing, I swear, I don't know that guy. I mean, he uses words, presumably, in our context, that none of us would use. I mean, he wouldn't go out his way to clarify, I don't know that guy who's dying. I mean, it's amazing. Peter went so far to even go with Jesus. And at the point of being able to prove his success, the image that he cast on everybody else, this is going to be who I am. The first thing he does every single time is experience the expectation we're told all the time, that's failure. He screwed up. He messed up. He became anything but who he thought and promised he would be. I mean, Peter's example through the Gospels, just take some time this week, or the next couple weeks, and just look up, do a Google search on Peter in the Bible. Do it on Bible Gateway, and you'll find every passage that has Peter in it. And just see how many times Peter goes from declaring, I'm going to be the successful one, and screws up every single time. Opens up his mouth, even after Jesus dies and resurrects and ascends, and after Pentecost, likely 20 years later, he does it again. He goes and tells us in Galatians chapter 2 that Paul had to confront and rebuke Peter like Jesus did to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. And as a result of his failure again, he led astray some really key Christians. That's what Paul tells us in Galatians chapter 2. I mean, every time Peter presents himself, Peter was only in this part of the world in Galatians chapter 2 because he was trying to step out in response to a vision God had given him that we discovered in Acts chapter 10, I believe it is, where the curtain is lowered, the sheet is lowered, and God tells him. And he has this amazing experience of actually going to Gentiles. Let's go look up some of this information. Every time Peter presents this picture or is given a picture that he is going to be successful, he seems to screw up. I mean, that's the guy's routine practice. And like you and I, he gets to a point where after Jesus resurrects, where he just has got to assume, by the emotion of the story in John chapter 21, that his failures now have added up enough that it must exclude him from being in the successful. And by successful, I simply mean those who actually please and follow through with Jesus. The successful are those who actually put practice to their words. That they don't just say, I believe in Jesus, they're people who actually follow Jesus. And Peter, by this point, by the tone in which Jesus describes him, says that I must no longer be in that group, because as Jesus tells this story, or as John tells us the story of Peter being reinstated, is how we describe it today, is Jesus comes to Peter and basically tells him, I love you, do you love me? And you might remember the story. Jesus asked that question, do you love me, 3 different times. And each time it tells us in an emotional expression that Peter reacts with greater level of emotion. You know, Jesus, that I love you. And in the face and in response to Peter's repeated failure, Jesus invites him to succeed. Say that again. In response, Jesus' reaction to Peter's repeated failures is to invite him into a group who can't succeed. In the face of his failures, Jesus invites Peter into a group despite his failures, and says, will you feed my sheep? And Peter becomes the one who's recorded in Acts chapter 2, who stands in front of the entire church on Pentecost, and is the one who is responsible verbally, although the others spoke. Peter says he spoke in front of all of them, and thousands were saved that day. Jesus took the messiest failure, who repeatedly failed and even failed afterwards, and turned him into the one who the Catholics often believe, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but he would almost be the first pope, and he has even cathedrals named after him. Why? Because Jesus was sure to go out of his way to tell Peter, your failures do not exclude you from following me. Your mistakes, your messing up, you disappointing people, you not being who you thought you would be, does not exclude you from following me and being successful in the things that actually matter, pleasing your Heavenly Father. Your failures, your sin does not exclude you. In fact, that's what Jesus came to do, is to die to create a bridge for us. That all your failures that once kept us in death, as we've been looking in Romans on Sunday mornings, actually creates the bridge for us, where we can cross over from our failures into the success that only Jesus provides. Or this is how the best way to describe it, is that Jesus says, all of these sins that bring death do not have to be death in you any longer. I'm going to give you new life through my Spirit. I don't know the tone in which you kind of approach life, but if you're like me, you probably assume the first time you make a mistake is the last time you have an opportunity not to. That the first time you make a mistake, that the first time you prove that you're incapable, or prove that you might not be capable, or just simply prove that you are capable of making mistakes, is the last time you have an opportunity to succeed. And Paul goes out of his way to tell us in Romans that while we are yet failures, while we are yet sinners, Christ died for us. Any and every mistake you guys might make over the next year will never exclude you from the blessings and the fruit of Jesus. Your failures, your mistakes of yesterday will never exclude you from being in the camp where Jesus says, you are forgiven, you are redeemed, you are restored, you are my child. Here is new life. Your failures can never exclude you from Jesus if you continually put your faith in Jesus. I want to look at all of you, and I can say it to Evan since he said it in the video, you should have confidence that you won't slip because Jesus is with you. And that even when you do slip up, just like Peter did when he had enough faith to step out into the water but couldn't walk, what did Jesus tell us he just did? He reached out his hand and he picked up Peter and he helped him walk back to the boat. You should have confidence that whatever failures you have done, they can be forgotten. Some of you guys today just need to accept the forgiveness of Jesus and forget those. And other of us just need to recognize that since Jesus has forgiven us, he has put us in a new place, and that is in a place where, as John said a couple weeks ago on Sunday morning, where we actually can bear fruit for God, that those failures no longer can exclude us from the life that Jesus has for us. A life of freedom and a life, maybe success is a little cliche, a little cultural, but it's true. That whatever failures you have faced or will face cannot and will not exclude you